there was something unique about Reagan. Maybe it's the Midwest, maybe it was how he was raised. You know, he used humor, not to tell a joke, but to make a point.
Exactly.
He was so optimistic, he was upbeat.
Right.
He was bold.
He was.
He was not afraid to take on the establishment. He didn't stand for the status quo. He would kind of appeal to people's higher calling, to their greater good.
Right.
Even while being strong in his position. And I think that's something that's probably, particularly for young people, for all of us, one of the most appealing things about being connected to him.
Welcome into the Tech Ed podcast on what has been a really, really special day for your host, Matt Kirchner. We are on location right now in Santa Barbara, California, but we spent the day at Rancho del Cielo, which is better known to many as the Reagan Ranch. An absolutely amazing time. That has been a lifelong dream of mine. We're going to talk all about that today, talk about the legacy of Ronald Reagan. It's going to be a great episode. What makes it even better, in fact, way better, as a matter of fact, is the gentleman with whom we are going to have that discussion. He's been on our podcast before. In fact, we'll talk about that a little later, help get this podcast started now, almost 5 years ago. Hard to believe, but such an honor to be joined today by the former governor of my home state of Wisconsin, now president of Young America's Foundation, Scott Walker. Governor, what an honor and a pleasure to have you back on the podcast.
We're thrilled to have you here, and to have you here right in the middle of the Reagan Ranch Center, where we're at the table and at the mics and everything that Ronald Reagan used for his radio addresses.
Absolutely.
So what were radio addresses back then would be podcasts today. So how perfect.
Yeah, it's absolutely perfect. And it's just, I grew up, I know you did as well, in the 80s. I was reflecting on this a day or so ago. When Ronald Reagan became president of the United States, I was 12 years old. And at the end of his second term, I was 20. So think about that from, starting in what was middle school back then, right? I was like sixth grade. And then I was a sophomore in college, give or take, at the end of his second term. I mean, those are like the most formative years of your life. And he was the president for those entire 8 years. And so I just have all these amazing memories of him as a leader, a very different time back then, and a different time at the beginning of his presidency than it was at the end of his presidency between 81 and 89, I guess it was, with the elections in 80 and 88. I mean, I'm asking a loaded question, but you have the same kind of feelings and that same warm sense that you get when you think about the legacy of Ronald Reagan.
That's exactly right. We're in the same generation, all those Gen Xers out there.
Right.
We can appreciate it. But yeah, a lot of times when we have students up at the Reagan Ranch, it's important to remind them of what was happening in the late 70s when we were really young.
Yep.
We had a malaise going on.
Right.
We had not just inflation, but stagnation. So both high prices because of high inflation and really low employment levels, so high unemployment, all the horrible things, plus the hostages in Iran for 440 days. We thought we were going to be bombed. A nuclear war was going to happen from the old Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries. And then Ronald Reagan came in.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I remember as a kid, one of the lines in that 80 campaign was, he said, it's a recession if your neighbor's out of a job. It's a depression if you're out of a job. It's a recovery when Jimmy Carter's out of a job.
Yeah, I remember that well.
And he brought in and turned the nation around. And for you and I and others in our generation, I think for a lot of us, certainly I became a conservative and Republican in part because of him, but more importantly, an optimist.
Right.
He was just somebody who believed in the American people. It's certainly part of what we saw and talked about at the Reagan Ranch.
Absolutely.
And it's just such a pleasure to be involved in the organization so tightly connected to President Reagan.
And we're going to touch on that tight connection between YAF and the Reagan Ranch and his presidency and so on in just a moment. Just to reflect for a second on what you just said, thinking back to late 70s, you've got Jimmy Carter was the president at that time. You used the word malaise. That was his word, right? And I think a lot of people, probably starting with our generation and older, remember the days of, you just have to put on an extra sweater during the energy crisis. Right. There's not much we can do about this. And I think your word optimism is exactly right. Is that Ronald Reagan ran for president believing that we could have a better America, proved over the course of those 8 years that there was a better America to be had, certainly left the country in a much better position than when he started. So that legacy carries on today. And like I said, just I need to thank you right at the outset here for an incredible day. I mean, I have all these memories. We'll talk about that in a bit, of watching Ronald Reagan at the ranch on the nightly news and so on. And then to be there physically today was just a really, really special experience. I want to give you an opportunity, Governor, to talk a little bit about Young America's Foundation. Now, you were with us, and I should mention this. When we started this podcast now almost 5 years ago, I think this will be episode 247, give or take. So we've been at this for a while. The first 2 or 3 months, I wanted to get some really well-known people on the podcast. And the whole idea was if I could get folks like Scott Walker to agree to be on, then when we go out and ask other guests that maybe we don't know quite as well because we've known you a long time, then those folks are like, oh, well, it's good enough for Scott Walker. It's good enough for me. I'll do this. That's exactly what happened. But need to thank you right out of the blocks for being an early guest and being willing to take a chance on us. Now the #1 podcast in STEM and technical education, one of the top technology podcasts on the globe, believe it or not. Certainly couldn't say any of that 5 years ago or 4.5 years ago when we did this, but thank you for that. When you were on, you talked about Young America's Foundation, amazing work you're doing for young people, for the kind of values that you and I both hold dear. But talk a little bit about the organization itself so that our listeners get refamiliarized with what you're doing.
Sure. YAF.org, YAF.org. A great way for folks listening. If you are a student and you want some help, or if you're a parent, grandparent, just know young people. We work with college, high school, and now middle school kids. We're a nonprofit, so we're not political, even though we're aligned with Ronald Reagan.
Yep.
Obviously, ideologically aligned, so believe in limited government, lower taxes, strong national defense, traditional kind of all-American values. And we do it in a variety of ways. We have programs like we do here at the Reagan Ranch. Sometimes it might be in Washington, D.C., could be at regional sites across the country. That's where we not only educate and inspire these students, and we do it by age category. So we don't mix college with high school or high school with middle school. We do them separately, unique. Part of it's education and inspiration, but really most importantly is to equip them to go back to their schools, their campuses, their communities, online, wherever it might be, and be engaged in real dialogue. Because one of our concerns is we see kind of a one-sided approach, particularly in higher education. And so we try to level the playing field. And then these kids go back, these young people, these young leaders, go to their schools or communities or campuses, and they get active. They do things. They bring in speakers. We bring in more speakers, right of center speakers than any other group in America on campuses. And so it could be Ben Shapiro, it could be Ben Carson, it could be Dr. Art Laffer. It's a whole array of people out there. And not just for our kids through our chapters, but even through other groups like College Republicans and so forth. And then finally, we broadcast all this. So our YouTube channel, YAF TV, has about 2 million subscribers.
Even more than the Tech Ed podcast.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
Close, some catching up to do. Go ahead.
But we have, last year we went over 2 billion views on all of our social media platforms. But I think it's because young people are hungry, that they've been told one point of view on so many of these issues, and they want to level the playing field. And it doesn't mean they believe everything that every one of our speakers says, but they at least want to, they're hungry for something more, have a real debate, to be like Reagan was, to be respectful and honorable, but to actually have a dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned a couple things. First of all, the apolitical nature of the organization, not endorsing candidates and so on. Here at the Tech Ed podcast, we say we're securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. I can tell you, we talk to a lot of folks from both ends of the spectrum, as you know. I've yet to have anybody come on the podcast and say that they don't think that securing the American dream for the next generation is a good idea, right? So we're the same way, right? It's all about the right values. It's about doing the right things. Glad that you mentioned Art Laffer's name as well. I mean, you think about the Laffer curve and the whole idea that we could actually raise the income to the federal government by lowering tax rates, and it doesn't quite seem that logical, but that's exactly what happened when you ignite the power of the American economy and, more importantly, the American people. It's incredible what happened. So really, really cool that we can be sitting in the same space that somebody like Art Laffer did. Let's talk a little bit about the Reagan Ranch itself, and that was, just to give our audience a sense. So we just got back, right? So we're on this bus. It's a little harrowing. It's literally you're climbing up. I don't know how many thousand feet.
You go from sea level where we're at right now, because the ocean's just 2 blocks away, to where the helipad was at with Marine One is
Yes.
2,600 feet.
Wow. So you're climbing 2,600 feet. I
Mhm.
mean, it's like the size of a ski hill or a ski
Yeah,
mountain, right?
it's a mountain, yeah.
Yeah, it is. And hairpin turns,
Right.
and we're in a bus, and you're kind of looking out over the edge. I mean, and then you get up there and driving through the gate, and now you know where it is, and then you see the ranch house itself, which again, as I mentioned earlier, all these incredible memories of Ronald Reagan. Whether it was signing legislation, spending time, on his horse and chopping wood. I mean, all these kind of things, and it's just like all these emotions come back to you as you're pulling in there, and that was really, really special. Young America's Foundation, and then we should mention that's the connection, right? Is that your organization, the organization of which you're the president, owns the ranch and has since 1998. Talk about the why, both on the YAF side and on the Reagan family side. How did that transaction come together?
Well, it worked out beautifully because YF originally started at William Buckley's home. It was called Young Americans for Freedom.
Yep.
We still call our chapters that on campus.
Okay.
2 years later, Ronald Reagan got involved, even before he was elected to anything, governor, president, you name it. He got involved in the national board. And then throughout the years, when our organization had college conferences, all 8 years he was president, he hosted some of them at the White House.
Did he really?
So really a strong personal connection. So in the later 90s, when the Reagan family, specifically Mrs. Reagan, First Lady Reagan, was looking to sell, because at that point he just physically wasn't able to ride and be at the ranch anymore. They were looking around. She originally looked to list it, to do it in the private a sale, and had some offers and was on the market for a while, but just really didn't feel comfortable about it. We have a video that always moves me. I've seen many times before, where she talks about this, and she gets teared up saying, selling this was, in her words, selling a part of Ronnie, as she said.
Of course.
And so, because he loved coming here, that's the reason they came to the ranch, because he loved to ride, and she grew to love it because of that as well. So in the end, it was not only that connection, but on top of that, the commitment of my predecessor and the board at the time was to keep it as is, to preserve it forever as not just a historical site, which it is, but then to use it as a means in which to share the things that Ronald Reagan cared about, the values that he had, the leadership style, some of the the permanent or endless, timeless, I should say, classic values he stood for. And when it was clear we were going to do that, not only did she sell it to Young America's Foundation, she brought everything back down to even in the bedroom. She and some of the staff at the time even made the bed in the bedroom because she wanted to be just as it was before. So,
and I was gonna, and I don't mean to interrupt you, Governor, but I was actually gonna ask exactly that in my next question, because I mean there were a lot of special moments today, right? But as we were driving back and talking with the small group of folks that I was chatting with on the bus on the way back down, fascinating that we're in the Reagan bedroom, right, at the ranch, right? So, and there's parts of the ranch, by the way, that we went into that you mentioned today, like up and, for the whole time they owned it, only like 4 people had been in the living room. I mean, this is really, it's a hallowed space. It's a sacred space in a lot of ways. And we're standing there at the foot of the bed, where Ronald and Nancy slept. And you tell the story about how when you kind of put all the pieces back together, Nancy Reagan actually made that bed, and it has stayed exactly that way since that time.
We haven't touched it since then. So the bed is her, not somebody else, but her making the bed, putting all the pieces back in place, and even wild things, which for our students are so touching. The only 2 things the previous owners, when they bought it in 1974, left in the entire house were 2 metal bed frames. And because of the generation that Ronald Reagan grew up in, even though he had been a movie star, he was a governor, eventually president, he still had that same Midwestern values. He zip ties the bed frames together, just like my grandfather was born the same year would have done. And then puts a mattress on. But the funny part, as you saw, was on his side of the bed he's still too tall. So his feet hang off the end. So there's a wood bench at the end.
Exactly.
I mean, people can't believe, it's like, that's exactly what happened. So much so that Michael Reagan, his son, who still talks to students up here, says every time he's up there, he feels like his dad's going to just walk out the front door.
It does feel like that the whole time, right? I mean, you just feel like he could come around the corner, and glad you mentioned Michael Reagan as well. A great has a great radio show himself. Is he still doing that show? I think, is he? Or...
No, he's off. He does a little bit of podcasting occasionally,
Okay,
but he
got
was
it.
on for like 25
Yeah,
years.
absolutely. That was a great show. So on this whole topic, you mentioned, I think today, that one of the middle schoolers was kind of marveling that the leader, literally the leader of the free world, is sleeping in a bed where he just puts a little extension, like a little footstool
Exactly.
at the end of it to put his feet on. Incredibly frugal guy, and that legacy is all over the ranch. But thinking about a middle school student in that space and spending time learning about Ronald Reagan. I mean, we saw it firsthand, right? But my kids and others of that generation obviously have no connection like that to Ronald Reagan. So they have to learn about him other ways, same way I maybe learned about JFK or folks that came before. So talk about the whole what you're doing with the ranch. I mean, you mentioned that you've got different groups of students that go up there. Why is that important? What do they learn? What do they tell you after that experience?
Yeah, it's a combination of things. So it varies obviously by age group, but with every one of them, though, the ranch itself is the magnet. It's the thing to be drawn in, and often it's because of other students tell them, "Believe me, you want to go see this."
Right.
But up at the ranch itself, one of the most amazing things is we find this with young people. The data shows overwhelmingly that fairness and authenticity are the premium, regardless of politics.
Right.
And so they come up here and they have this really genuinely authentic experience where they see this is a guy who, talked about frugality, talked about these things and then lived it.
Right.
No, he wasn't doing it for show. Nobody was up there. Like you said, up until we took it over, only 4 people had been there his entire time he owned the property in the living room. He lived it. He built his own fence posts. He lived in a, relatively small ranch house. You saw in the garage, he put his nuts and bolts and screws and washed out Peter Pan and Jiffy peanut butter jars, just like my grandfather did on the farm.
Everyone's,
right? And so he lived a life that wasn't Hollywood based. It wasn't political based. He most certainly could have, and people would have not been surprised. I think the shocking part is they say, this guy's the real deal. And the beauty of that is then when we share other things about, a speech he gave October 27th, 1964, called The Time for Choosing.
Yep.
We talked about the speech at the Brandenburg Gate when he called on General Gorbachev to tear down the wall, right? Those sorts of things, suddenly young people are interested in.
Yep.
Because they're like, he's the real deal. I had a kid actually once say to me, I can't believe there's nothing about Hollywood here.
Yeah.
It wasn't even just the other stuff. It was, there's no Hollywood posters. There's no Emmys. There's no, he's not the trappings of a movie star.
Right.
It's just a very normal Midwestern humble guy.
Yep. Which is, and that's exactly how he was wired. And I think it's a great lesson for young people, especially now. I mean, you think about some of the ideals, I guess, that you think drive Gen Z, and you talk about fairness, and that's a huge one, right? And I think unless you recognize that, someone like Ronald Reagan was all about almost like the original equity and his, equity of opportunity or equality of opportunity. He was kind of the real deal. And in so many ways, I think, it's been fun kind of to watch his legacy morph over the course of time. Right. So, I mean, we live in a political age now. It was a political age in the 80s. There were people that loved Ronald Reagan. There were people that didn't. It kind of in the same sense of what's happened. I think about somebody like Abraham Lincoln. You don't think about his politics. You think about him as a leader. You think about his principles and what he stood for. And then you think about somebody like JFK. And I'm actually, in fact, I'll tell you, the second greatest speech I think I've ever heard was JFK's Go to the Moon speech.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just an incredible speech, right? And so, other side of the aisle, I saw, the politics were different in the 60s, of course, from Ronald Reagan, but an incredibly endearing legacy, a great leader and someone that we can look to as an example. It feels like, and tell me if you agree, that as we, the deeper we get and the more distance we put between Ronald Reagan, the quote politician, and Ronald Reagan, the person, that people think about who he was as a person and less about his politics. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I think for sure, I think he's almost universally revered. And I think that's a good thing because obviously you and I were fans. I think a part of it is because it worked. The things he did were effective. I mean, you even look at not only Bush, but then years later into Clinton.
Sure.
And then he would say the peace dividend that he brought about, that we lived under the Cold War and all the buildup, even though he built up the military, we were able to ease off of some of that over time because we won the Cold War without ever firing a shot, as Margaret Thatcher said. And so we had a balanced budget, not just because of the people at that time, but really because of the work done by Ronald Reagan, the successes he had, the things worked. And then there's an exhibit just the floor above us called Reagan's Critics, where some of the same people involved in politics today were criticizing him then. They praise him now,
For sure.
which is interesting
It is.
because nothing's changed other than
Right.
time.
Yep, exactly right.
Time changed because it worked. We saw it worked. And on top of that, I think the other key part, which I think is the essence of your question, is we also look back and saw not only his policies work, but that there was something unique about Reagan. He was so optimistic. He was upbeat.
Right.
He was bold.
He was.
He was not afraid to take on the establishment. He didn't stand for the status quo. But maybe it's the Midwest. Maybe it was how he was raised. Maybe it was a little all of the above. But he used humor, not to tell a joke, but to make a point.
Exactly.
He would kind of appeal to people's higher calling, to their greater good, even while being strong in his positions. And I think that's something that's probably, particularly for young people, for all of us, one of the most appealing things about being connected to him.
Right.
And why I flat out tell our students that we work with, be a happy warrior. That's what Ronald Reagan was, a happy warrior.
Yeah, absolutely. He was always so positive. The sense of humor is just great. And his ability to tell a joke and to make a point at the same time was absolutely, absolutely incredible. I mentioned the second greatest speech in the hist that I've ever heard. You didn't ask me what the first one was, so you want me to talk about that?
Tell it, please.
Yeah, absolutely. If nobody's ever heard the Kennedy speech at Rice University, I think it was 1962, which was, basically charging the whole nation, the entire United States, with the idea that we could put a man on the moon. Great, great speech. Ronald Reagan's speech at Pointe du Hoc on the 40th anniversary of D-Day was just, there's just nothing better. I'll say we'll link that one up in the show notes so people can check it out. Same thing with the John F. Kennedy speech. And since, by the way, I was going to ask, the Nancy Reagan video where she talks cheerfully, is that something that's available on YouTube?
Sure, on YouTube. Yeah, awesome. We have so much stuff on YAF TV.
Yeah, awesome. So
on YouTube.
We'll link that up as well. But that just watching Ronald Reagan sitting or standing there delivering that speech was it's just incredible. George H.W. Bush, his vice president who followed him as president, once asked him, how in the world did you give that speech without getting emotional and tearing up? And Ronald Reagan said, if I thought about the words I was saying, he said, I would literally get emotional. So I just had to deliver that speech without even thinking about what I was saying, just saying the words. But it's an incredibly emotional and effective.
And we
speech.
just took a group of our top 25 campus activists in June, the first week of June, for the commemoration of D-Day. And as they came in, we had them listen on the shuttle to that exact speech because it's just so powerful. And being at that point, you see where they literally, with that memorial, the daggers on the way in, while the enemy fire was coming down. It's amazing that any of them survived.
Yeah, it is.
And he was so, here you think 40 years later, now 41 years later, and we still remember that speech as one of the greatest of all time.
It was just absolutely incredible. So I would encourage everybody to go back and check that out. I also want to encourage you, Governor, to share some other Ronald Reagan stories. I talked about, watching him at the ranch and how powerful those images were. Chopping wood. He just looked comfortable in his element. He wasn't like the kind of guy that got on a treadmill every day. That was his version of exercise, physical exercise. Incredible shape, an incredible rider. Yeah. And we'll talk in a minute about the book Riding with Reagan by John Barletta, who, as you know, of course, is a former Secret Service agent that spent 17 years with him. You know that better than I do. And just some of the stories about the two of them riding together, and what a great rider he was. So just incredibly powerful, signing major legislation. The largest tax cut in history was signed at the Reagan Ranch. So I've got all these memories of the Reagan Ranch. I probably stole the easy ones and left you with the hard ones. But tell me a little bit about what you remember from those days growing up in the 80s about Ronald Reagan.
One of the sayings he said that I think embodies why he loved the ranch so much was he said, there's nothing better for the inside of a man than the outside of a horse.
Right.
And the idea being that when he would go there, and Margaret Thatcher actually asked him about this on her visit, is there something about being here that inspires you? And there was. He just loved it. He loved working the land like so many other ranchers and farmers do, but it cleared his mind. He often called it an open air cathedral, that riding through those areas, all of which he cleared, cleared the brush, which is, people don't think about how hard that is. It's not just you or I clearing above our head. Right. You have to clear on top of that to go on top, above your head on a horse. Right. So he had those longer extended saws and chainsaws and everything else he did. But it wasn't just about working out or feeling good. For him, this is where he went to clear his mind. This is where he went to think about the big issues. He'd start most mornings with the presidential daily briefing.
Mm-hmm.
He'd go through all the, in many cases, the horrific stuff he had to deal with as president. Remember, all the time he was there, typically just outside in international waters, there was a Soviet submarine, nuclear submarine pointed directly to his spot. J.J. Quinn, now a retired rear admiral, was his military aide for several years, and he now speaks to our kids all the time. And he said, yeah, they knew how many minutes they had to get off the property if they were under attack there.
Wow.
And so you have all those things going on. So for him to go there, it was just the way to get away from it all, think through these big ideas. I think it's one of the best things about connecting Ronald Reagan to young people is his words, the things he shared are timeless. Whether it was things he said at the ranch or something like the speech he gave a week before the 1964 presidential election, minus a few things about Barry Goldwater, you could give that speech today. You could talk, as he did, about the two businessmen who knew a guy who'd come from Cuba, and they said how lucky they were. And the guy from Cuba said, I'm the lucky one. I had somewhere to go to. And his point was that we lose freedom here, there's nowhere else in the world left.
Exactly.
The speech at the Brandenburg Gate that he gave in June of '87, tear down this wall. The comments he's given time and time again, not just in big speeches, but even things like the idea that freedom, which he said many, many times, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. It's something you have to fight for and defend and pass on to the next generation, the same thing. That's probably for us the most potent thing at the ranch. The other one along with that is he said there's a spark inside of each and every one of us that if just struck just at the right time, can inspire the rest of their lives. And that's really what we endear to do when we bring kids to the ranch. It's just so powerful and so motivating for these kids.
Absolutely. Speaking of sparks that kind of change the way that you look at your life, and I want to actually, I'll tee up this question by asking this. One of the most memorable days of my life was the day that Ronald Reagan got shot. Not long into his presidency at all. Do you remember where you were when you heard the news?
I do.
Yeah, tell me.
I was at Mrs. Brower's. Lived in a house just on the edge of town. She had a Cub Scout pack. And because I was about your age, I think I was 12 or 13 at the time, I was a den chief. I was a Boy Scout, but you had a couple.
I was a den chief,
right?
Too. Yeah. Are you an Eagle Scout?
I am an Eagle Scout.
So am I.
So there you go.
Absolutely.
Once an Eagle, always an Eagle.
You got it.
But I was a den chief, and I remember I was helping these kids, and all of a sudden, Mrs. Brower came in and she was crying. Because people forget about it. It wasn't just our horror, but for our parents and that older generation. 20 years before John F. Kennedy had been shot and killed, there was this whole, and I'm not superstitious, but there was this whole thing all the way back to Harrison of this curse that every 20 years, and the math had worked, so Reagan would have been the next one in that queue. Thankfully, that didn't happen.
For sure.
Tell you a lighter story about that, though, and somebody down in Dixon, his old hometown, told me this. So when Reagan was shot, there's that jarring news out there. The Secret Service agent in charge that day was a guy named Jerry Parr. Jerry Parr, when he was a kid, saw a movie called The Code of the Secret Service. He didn't directly go into law enforcement. In fact, he ended up being a guy working on the polls for Florida Power and Light. And when he was 32 years old, the Secret Service came through town, and were recruiting non-traditional agents. And they recruited him. Went back to this movie, thought, oh, well, maybe I want to do this. Got trained, worked for, not just Reagan, worked for many presidents. The day that Ronald Reagan was shot, March of 1981, Jerry Parr is the agent in charge when Ronald Reagan walks out of the Hilton right there in Washington.
Washington, D.C.,
They at first didn't think he was shot, and then realized when he got in the car, he had a pain. So
thought he broke his ribs when
the door pushed him in so hard. And Jerry went against protocol, which would have been to go back to the White House. Instead, split-second decision, goes to George Washington University Hospital, which we found out later where the bullet went in. Had they not gotten there sooner, Ronald Reagan would have probably bled out and died because of how close it was to his heart. And so that move probably saved his life.
It's incredible.
What's amazing is the inspiration for him ultimately deciding to go in the Secret Service was this movie, The Code of the Secret Service, that starred none other than Ronald Reagan.
Amazing. That's
Isn't
a
it funny?
great story.
So
Yeah.
I tell kids
You
that
get
all the time because
goosebumps, yeah.
like there are things in your life
Mhm.
that could change not only your life but the rest of the world for good or for bad.
Right.
So choose wisely.
Yeah, exactly.
Make good choices in
Yeah,
your life.
exactly, and a little bit of fortune, but yeah, just that wisdom, and I think if I remember, isn't there some story about one of the agents in back actually saw some blood coming out of the president's mouth, and that was what kind of created that split second decision,
Right. Because he knew how serious it was.
Yeah, exactly. So, for what it's worth, and I remember exactly. I was in the state of Indiana, believe it or not, when I heard the news that Reagan had been shot. I was driving with my parents back to Wisconsin from Disney World, and we're listening to the radio, and my brother and I in the back seat, my mom and dad in front, and all of a sudden, special alert. And of course, back then you didn't have any kind of, Twitter didn't, fire any alert on your phone. You didn't get any news alert. You heard about it by, some special news bulletin, and that the president had been shot. And I remember the whole idea of, at first they thought that he, that was just a near miss, and there were some other people that were hit, but not him. And then, come to find out later that he was really, really close to not making it through that for a period of time.
Well, remember, and they showed this in the last year, the Reagan movie.
Right.
But I remember at that time, Bernard Shaw, I remember seeing the reports about this afterwards. But he on CNN, back when CNN was just a 24-hour news program, it was it was not left or right. It was just the news. He was getting things in his ears, and he was actually upset. Like, tell me what's really happening.
Right.
Because it was all happening live.
So
no one had a
fast.
clue. They weren't getting any insights. Again, I think for a lot of folks, our parents' age or older, there was a real panic. Because, again, not only because it happened every 20 years, but because all the talk about Reagan and the Russians and everything else. Did the Soviet Union do this? Is this an attack? What exactly is going on?
Yeah, you didn't have any idea exactly what was going on.
Here as he went in, though, showed classic Reagan humor. Yep. He looks up at the surgeons and he says, "I hope you're all Republicans."
Yeah.
And the surgeon, to their credit, in charge said, "Today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans."
Right, exactly, and that is the perfect example of his humor. Also telling his wife Nancy when she first sees him, "I forgot to duck." Right, it was in the heat of this incredibly dangerous moment to have that sense of humor that really, I think, in a lot of ways that carried him through, his entire career, and was a sense of solace for him, I think, in a lot of ways as well. We talk about the role of the Secret Service, about that split second decision. Let's talk a little bit about John Barletta, Secret Service agent, who, if folks haven't read Riding with Reagan, and I've read, Dinesh D'Souza's book, Reagan Diaries. I haven't read them all, but I've read a lot of Ronald Reagan biographies and so on. That one captures the side of him that I don't know that I've seen in any of the other ones. Just this personal relationship between the two of them, how it was created, and that bond that carried through not just the presidency, but literally through the rest of Ronald Reagan's life, to the point where he declines an invitation to sit at I think one seat away from Nancy Reagan at the memorial service in Washington D.C., but then ultimately came to the one here in California. But talk about John Barletta. It's just an incredible human being. Did you ever meet him, by the way?
Oh, yeah. He was, after we came to the Reagan Ranch, the first year I was governor, which was a great respite in her own right, my wife got recruited and joined the Reagan Ranch Board of Governors, and John was a part of that, along with Admiral Quinn and some of the others who worked with the president. And John was just a wonderful guy, a thick Boston accent. He would train service dogs for military veterans. And so oftentimes Tonette would say, under the table, sometimes she'd feel a lick on her leg. It was one of the service dogs that'd be in these meetings. But John was just a wonderful guy. And he was involved with this because he just wanted to help preserve the legacy of the man he worked for. And he had worked for other presidents, but as you mentioned, he was really with Reagan till the very end. And just such a decent and honorable man. It's fun. We have up at our Secret Service command post at the ranch all these cool videos we've just added with a display and a touch screen.
That was beautiful. That's
and
really
there's
cool.
A bunch of them with John telling these stories, wonderful stories about Gorbachev coming up and being kind of condescending because they thought there'd be a big mansion up there like they all would have had. And there's not. And so they didn't tell him when he put his hat on backwards when he had the cowboy hats on, or telling the story about Queen Elizabeth coming up and being in the rain and wanting to ride. But John, when he first started, John had been in Boston, had been with the police department, knew how to ride. And so he tells this great story about how early on, Ronald Reagan learned in the military. So he sat English style up in the saddle. So when he first was president, he would have agents and he would go riding out there. And he'd jump over trees that were down,
Right.
jump over rocks, and none of them could keep up with him.
Yeah, all these poor Secret Service agents that didn't know how to ride, certainly at that level, and their job is to here
And one
protect
of
the
them-
leader of the free world.
Yeah, finally, one of the last straws was one guy falls off and breaks his arm,
Right.
and President Reagan gets off and is providing aid to him.
I know, exactly.
And that's when they're like, okay, this is the
gotta change.
opposite of what's supposed to happen.
Yep.
Particularly, again, remember at the time, because at least some of his critics were making fun of his age, and his age was not a problem. This guy was he was like a major
Incredible
league.
shape, yeah.
And so the director finally said, we got to get somebody who can ride with the president.
Right.
And they found out that John could ride English style. He rode up in the saddle, and he was good. He was competent. So the president tested him out a little bit and saw that he could do all this. And he said to the ultimate, his boss, he's like, you found somebody who can keep up with me.
Yeah,
This
he
is great.
found a good one, yeah.
Well, then after that, they just bonded because every time they were riding, they'd be together. And John was on it. I mean, good examples you even see around this place. You can tell pictures. The first month or two, he would ride with him. He wasn't an exact decoy, but he'd try to be careful to look somewhat like the president.
Right.
So one day he asked one of the snipers up in the hill if he could tell who was the president, who was him. He said, sure, because John was running a dark horse. He said, the president's on a white horse.
Right.
From that point forward, John always rode a white horse.
Yep.
And so he was just that attentive to trying to help the president, and ultimately was so close to him, was like a family member,
Right.
that when it came time to tell him he really physically couldn't ride anymore, it was John that Mrs. Reagan asked to do it.
Yeah, we heard that story up on at the ranch today. That story is told in the book as well. Super touching. You know, you can't hardly read that part of the story without tearing up. On the other side of the emotional spectrum, the sense of humor. That one of the stories that was in that book that I just thought was hilarious. I think, and everybody gets something different out of the book. You mentioned the snipers and how the idea was that they were the ranch being 2,600 feet up.
26 at where the helipad was at 2,600.
Yeah, so you're 2,600 feet. So you think about the president riding around his ranch, surrounded by mountains, right? So so the idea would be that if anybody was to pose a threat to him, that there were sniper teams that were up on the ranch, basically providing protection for the president that way. But there's a story about how the press used to set up on the mountains around the ranch with their big telephoto lenses, right? And would just try to, catch whatever was going on there. And so as they're riding up on a ridge, and Ronald Reagan says to John Barletta, do you think they can see us? And John Barletta says, well, yes, Mr. President, I'm sure they can see us. And he said, would you be okay if I, suddenly grabbed my chest and fell over like I was having a heart attack? And John was like, no, Mr. President, that would not be a good idea. But I mean, it's just that, that sense of humor that he had was absolutely amazing. In as much, Governor, we're a technology podcast, right? We're talking a lot about the legacy of Ronald Reagan, which is just, I'm having a wonderful time having this conversation. You think about the technology side of things. And one of the things, if folks didn't grow up in that era, this whole idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which a lot of people thought was crazy, right? There were a lot of people, so folks aren't familiar, I won't get it perfect, but the whole idea was that we would create a dome over the United States where we could shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles and create a defensive posture against, at that time, the Soviet Union. So if they were to unilaterally begin a nuclear war, rather than having to necessarily retaliate in kind, we could shoot these out of the sky. People thought that was nuts, right? They called it Star Wars. They had all kinds of name for it. And Reagan stuck with that to the point of literally not signing an arms treaty with Russia at Reykjavik because they had asked him to basically step down from his position on SDI. And again, a lot of people just thought this was hocus pocus. Now here we are in the year 2025. You think about what just happened, as recently as what was going on in Israel earlier this year. It's a real thing. I mean, so was he crazy or was he ahead of his time?
Way ahead of his time.
Yeah.
And remember at Reykjavik, when he walked out over those discussions, he actually offered to Gorbachev the technology.
Yeah.
He said the deal will be, we're not just going to, if it's truly a defensive technology, he said the whole, each superpower should have it because then neither one has the advantage in terms of an offensive attack. It becomes limited.
Exactly.
So I thought about that not just this year, but soon after things broke out after the attacks 2 years ago on Israel on the 7th of October. And the first wave you saw, I remember one of the pictures that we saw, I don't know if the AP or somebody put on all sorts of newscasts, it was of this image at night of all these missiles coming. And as I recall, most of them, I think, were from Hezbollah at the time. You had literally almost like you envisioned this dome.
Yeah.
You had all these images of them being one after another knocked down, like something out of a movie.
It is.
And I said, that's the
SDI.
SDI right there.
Exactly.
You know, that he was ahead of his time. It may not, it certainly wasn't fully operational at the time,
Right.
but the vision, I think, was powerful. Prime example, I think of many of the things I love about Reagan was his ideas are his speeches, his talks, his ideas are timeless. They're not unique to the 1980s.
Exactly.
These are things we saw were just as effective today. And if done for the right reasons, again, his goal was not to take over the Soviet Union or to take over the Soviet bloc countries, but was to, as he pointed out, for decades, the policy of the West had been to contain communism.
Right.
He wanted to transcend it.
He did.
And you do that. He felt not just the American people, he felt the people even in those Soviet bloc countries yearned for freedom.
Yeah, and he was
They just
right.
didn't give it right. And exactly. That's why the wall came down so quickly. So that's just a good example with technology and with ideas. He was way ahead of his time.
For sure. I remember, my dad, who's now 89 years old and lived through World War II, had two brothers that fought in Europe. It's still one of the only times I ever saw him tear up was telling the story of when his brother Dwayne came back from Europe, and my dad was 9, and like how special that was when the Berlin Wall came down, kind of signaling the end of, at least the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. He said that was the most significant news story of his entire life at the time, like on the day that it happened. I mean, that's how, for someone that had lived through World War II, had lived through, Vietnam and so on, that was the most significant event of his entire life, which so to put that event into perspective for folks that maybe didn't live through it or aren't as familiar, it was monumental.
And it is amazing because you think about what happened when Ronald Reagan comes in. Even in America, there are some people that think Soviet-style communism might actually be more effective than American-style capitalism.
That's so crazy.
Which we're coming back at, recircling back. The idea of market-based capitalism is true market-based, not crony, not imperial, but market-based entrepreneurial capitalism is much better than government-driven socialism or it's evil cousin communism where it's outright taking control. But at that time, there was a sense of that. Reagan comes in and it's just transformational. And the military buildup, he won it, not because he won a war. He won it because he didn't have to go to war. And he squeezed them not only in terms of the military, but the economic changes that basically all but bankrupt them from being able to compete.
That's exactly what happened. Yeah, he pulled them into a war that never a shot was fired, but that they couldn't win economically, and ultimately that dismantled the Soviet regime. So it's just absolutely incredible. You talk about Reagan's principles being transcending time, transcending politics. Talk about those principles. What are some of the more endearing principles that Ronald Reagan held dear?
Well, certainly on a personal level, I think about his optimism. I mean, it's why the humor, it's why the upbeat, it's appealing to a higher nature. He talked about one of his last addresses, the shining city on the hill. But at the same time, being an optimist, but that didn't mean being wishy-washy. He had firm beliefs. He stayed with them. I was always amazed reading a number of those books and others, particularly the Nash book, that even within his own team, particularly for some folks who'd come into his team through the Bush camp, there were folks that came in thinking they knew more than he did.
Lots of them.
And they realized over time that Ronald Reagan knew exactly what he was doing. There's a great book called In His Own Hand that are all these old speeches and radio addresses he worked on. It's in like print like you'd expect in a book, but it actually includes the slashes and the marks and the changes to show you that oftentimes early on his way up to the Reagan Ranch, the Rancho del Cielo, he'd have someone else drive. He obviously wasn't driving. He'd be writing ideas for speeches and radio addresses and others. This was someone who spent a major portion of his public life thinking about these big, bold ideas. And so when you think about what are the big ones, to me, it's overall, it's freedom. It's like, what does freedom mean? Economic freedom, religious freedom, political freedom. He talked about that literally in his farewell address from the Oval Office about how it's fragile, must be cared for. You got your word on it. He talked about the need for people to come back to the kitchen table and come together as families and talk about what it means to be an American and greatness and to to abide by shared civic rituals. I think overall, he talked about, I thought one of the other big things that we see in the House is authenticity, being who you are.
Totally.
Ed Meese, the former Attorney General, says if you want to learn about the Reagan administration, you go to the library. If you want to learn about Reagan the man, you go to the ranch.
Yeah, that's great.
See how he lived, what he lived, which very much came out of the Midwest.
Did.
He comes with humble roots. He doesn't have privilege. This is a guy who, family never owned a house.
Right.
Everyone was rented.
Yeah.
Constantly, because his father's bouts with alcoholism, constantly moving to smaller places, doing odd jobs, worked from the 14 on, worked as a lifeguard, saved 77 lives.
Right.
Went to Eureka, which is a local community college. He was on Hollywood, but he wasn't an A. He was a B star.
Right.
It's like being a warm-up act, but earned his way up. And just kept learning and focusing and sharing and honing those values that were important all throughout the rest of his public life.
And never compromising on them, and
Right.
just being so simple. I mean, he boiled. We always talk about boiling things down to their lowest common denominator, right? The more simple you can make it, and then of course his incredible ability to communicate with the American people, which I think is another one of the things that you felt like he was talking directly to you, right? And whenever he was giving a speech, whether it was, I think back to when when the space shuttle tragedy took place, and his ability to, to connect with the American people that way. But just they called him a great communicator for a reason. He was just an absolutely incredible communicator. So, kind of taking a little bit and one step further, and you and I have known each other a long time, crossed paths a few times at Marquette University, and I certainly knew you well when you were the Milwaukee County Executive. I had the honor of being the chair for the volunteers for all the Operation Freedom events that we did at the Milwaukee County Zoo, and I'm telling these stories for our audience's benefit. So and then of course you become governor of the state of Wisconsin, have 2 amazing terms as governor. I'm gonna say one thing, and then I'll ask you a question about how Ronald Reagan has impacted and influenced your leadership style. But you and I were on a plane together by total coincidence a couple weeks ago. We were both on our way to Washington D.C. Had an opportunity to catch up a little bit, and one of the things that Ronald Reagan had on his desk was a plaque that said, there's no limit to what a man can accomplish if he doesn't mind who gets the credit. And you and I were talking about a little bit about some of the development that's happening. Wisconsinites will be familiar with this, our national audience less so, but happening in Southeast Wisconsin, in so much part it was a result of your leadership and you standing up for some principles that you thought were really important. And now we've got this huge explosion in investment with all kinds of companies, Uline and Haribo, and now we've got Microsoft is putting these data centers in there. None of that would have happened had it not been for the governorship of Scott Walker. And of course, when I told you that as we were landing, and I'm like, maybe not everybody gives you credit for that, but I do. And you said, I don't really care if I get credit for that or not. If it's good for the people of Wisconsin, it's good for, that's good enough for me, or something along those lines. That was Ronald Reagan, right? I mean, there was no limit to what he could accomplish if he didn't mind who gets the credit. So, if you were going to use that one, I'm going to steal it from you and just use it as an example. But how else has Ronald Reagan impacted your leadership style and your whether it's president of YAF or your time as governor and so on?
Well, certainly one of the best things I did, particularly when about the time I was here for the first time, where it was in between some pretty massive protests at our state capitol over some major reforms we were pushing, and then having to face and ultimately win the first recall election in American history for a governor, was definitely took a page out from Reagan. And that was when the protests were going on, instead of just staying in the Capitol, where the Capitol was under siege, there's chaos, the security detail was very, very concerned. All I could think of with Reagan was how effective he was going around the country and using the bully pulpit, and making the case directly to the American people. And so within a week, we started going around the state. We went to manufacturing plants, we went to small businesses, we went to schools, we went to you name it, hospitals, we went to all sorts of places. And I just remember how, one, it was effective for communicating our message because we were getting out, we weren't afraid, we were sharing the message. Two, how affirming it was to connect with people who'd say, boy, hang in there. My family's praying for you.
Hmm.
You're doing the right thing. You're doing it for the right reasons. That was powerful because in the capital, whether it's in Madison, Wisconsin, where our state house is at, or certainly
Right.
in Washington, D.C., it's easy to get sucked in the bubble.
Yeah, for
You know,
sure.
it's
Yeah,
easy
you're
to,
insulated,
yeah,
and
exactly. And so we got out, and I just kept remembering that Reagan was so good
hmm
at not that he didn't work with. Tip O'Neill's a prime example. He certainly worked.
for sure.
All 8 years he was president, Democrats controlled the House.
Hmm.
The last 2 years, the Democrats controlled the Senate. But when he had balance there, he worked with them. He got the largest tax cut in American history, which was signed at the ranch,
Yep.
was passed with a huge number of Democrats who voted for it.
It's amazing to think about that today, right?
Right.
I mean, that just, go on.
Well, some of them were blue dog Democrats
Of
that maybe
course.
aren't around anymore, fortunately. But he went out to those districts and didn't attack them. He actually, I mean, this is really remarkable when you think about it. He went out and made the case in those districts.
Right. And in a day, obviously, long before you had a Twitter handle or whatever ways we
Right.
have to communicate directly with people now. I mean, he literally had to go out and shake hands and meet people and of course make his case from whatever, from the Oval Office or wherever else he was. But that was just that incredible ability.
He was
So-
really good on discipline, too. He would repeat the message over and over again,
Yep.
maybe in new and unique ways.
Yep.
It's something that a lot of folks could take note of today.
Totally. Yep.
Because it just takes discipline. I mean, I think that goes back to his days in Hollywood and the head of the Screen Actors Guild. Really, people don't start to really sink in on issues, on things you're talking about, until you've said it at least 7 or 8 times.
Yep.
And a lot of people in politics today want to say it once and move on.
Yep.
That's not the way to get it done.
7 times, 7 different ways. We say that all the time, and so it's okay to repeat yourself, and it's okay to send it in a bunch of different mediums, because eventually you're going to hit somebody on whatever medium they connect with you on, and that's how you get a
Exactly.
message out. So another great Ronald Reagan lesson. I feel like we could sit and tell Reagan stories here for another couple hours, Governor. I know your time is valuable. A couple more questions. The first thought that I have is just to chat a little bit about the Reagan legacy, and from an education standpoint, what we should be sharing with our children. You talk about having middle school students, high school students up to the ranch. If I'm a high school educator, I'm a middle school educator, and I want my students to get familiar with what the Ronald Reagan legacy is all about, what should I be telling them?
Well, I mean, it certainly goes back to that sense of optimism.
Right.
I'd say optimism. I'd tell them, read, or these days you can watch on YouTube. I'd pick out maybe a half dozen to 10 different speeches and ask them to watch them.
There you go.
Because I think there's so many that are timeless. Even that Time for Choosing was a speech, really, in its essence, set up for Barry Goldwater.
In the 60s.
Like a week before the 64 election.
Right.
And yet it's so classic. I mean, there's so much in it that is so relevant today. You look at the, certainly the Brandenburg Gate speech. You look at the 1980 speech he gave at the acceptance speech he gave at the convention that year. I just think you pick out speeches like that. Certainly the 40th anniversary speech for D-Day.
Yep.
They're just timeless classics.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that's why we took that group to Normandy and had them listen to that again.
Right.
Not because we're connected with Reagan, because I don't think there's any better way to send a group to Normandy than listening to a speech like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it covered all the important things about not just the United States, but our allies, what all was at stake, the bravery, the sacrifice, what was at risk.
Right. And the incredible debt, by the way, that we owe to that generation, which I think as time goes on, and I think about the fact that, like, I know a lot more about World War II than I do about World War I. Why? It's a little bit generational. I was born within a quarter century or so of the end of World War II. You start to lose some of that stuff. And so listening to that also draws them back.
I think that's totally right. And I think it's helpful. Ironically, Democrats have grown more appreciative of Reagan, or at least Americans, not politicians.
Right.
Be they Democrat or Republican, have yearned more for him just because, one, he's successful, and two, just the mannerism, the style, the tone that he used. So I think that's a powerful lesson as well for school, is the happy warrior, the upbeat side, how he appealed to our better nature. And I think that explains, it may never happen again, why not just in the re-elect 49 states, but in the original election,
Right.
40 of the 50
It's
states.
amazing if you think about that.
Yeah, and in a world where we're so polarized, but it wasn't that far off, and so ironically, there's a little bit fringe on the right who says, "Oh, he wasn't tough enough on this or that or whatever." I think part of it is lose sight of the fact, like you said, the House was an opposite party,
Right.
so it's
They had
remarkable
to
what he got
compromise.
done
Yeah.
with a split government, and the fact that even though he was upbeat and positive, one of the things I said in my inaugural address the first time I was in, again, directly ties into Reagan. I said, moderate in tone, but not in action.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But I meant not speaking in moderate language
Right.
or language of a moderate, but rather
Respectful and
exactly
Yeah.
decent, honorable, but still pushing big, bold ideas.
right.
We would fare better in our society today
Right.
if more people were not only engaged in dialogue,
Right.
but willing to listen to
100%.
people they disagree with
Totally.
and actually engage in a dialogue. Doesn't mean change your mind, doesn't mean give up on your principles,
Yep.
but not just wait till they're done talking, but actually listen to what they're saying
Right.
and then talk about it.
Absolutely. I've got friends across the political spectrum, and if they're listening, they'll know who they are. I learn more from my friends with whom I disagree
Yeah.
than the ones that I agree with. And over time, I probably become a little bit more politically moderate, a little bit more over time, just by taking the time to listen. And I think in a lot of ways, that's what Reagan was all about. Was all right. Let's figure out the things that we agree on, and to reiterate, securing the American dream for the next generation. Nobody argues with that. Doesn't matter
Right.
who they are.
Right.
He was just really, really good at figuring out what those enduring principles were of being an American, of the United States, and just pounding those home to the American people. Really, 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 really valuable. Do you remember where you were when you found out he passed away in 2004?
That one I don't remember as vividly. I remember hearing it, but by then I was county executive, and it was a little bit nothing like today with social media and X,
Right.
but we were a little bit more connected. So I believe it was actually a post I heard about when I was at the county executive's office. I don't remember it was which platform, but reading a bit about that online. I don't think it was
Right.
a social media post. Watching the Reagan movie last year, the tail end in the credits, they show excerpts of the funeral
Yeah.
and of the parade out to Simi Valley. And I got to tell you, that part in particular just took me back
For
to
sure.
just the closest thing I think we'd seen to that in our lifetime was John F. Kennedy, and we didn't, not in our lifetime, I should say, in modern history.
Right.
You or I weren't born when he passed away, but we had seen the images of.
Totally.
So the closest thing we'd seen was the images of the Kennedy funeral,
Right.
which of course is even more intense because he was the president
Right.
at that time. He was
Exactly.
assassinated.
Yep.
Reagan was many, many years later.
Exactly.
And yet there was still that, all the people who streamed through the Capitol, all the people who lined the freeways when the hearse came through in California,
Right.
it just showed how much love there was for America,
Totally.
for him, even though, remember, about 10 years before he died, he sent that letter out
Yep.
about his Alzheimer's.
Yeah. Into the sunset of his life.
Right, and then left.
Right.
So this is a guy who hadn't been on the forefront of media for 10 years and still had
Exactly.
that.
Yeah, I know he still had that power on the American people. I remember exactly where I was. I was actually mountain biking in Colorado, and we were in an RV. And my wife, who knows that Ronald Reagan, I'll tell you that story about how he's kind of been my hero for my entire adult life for sure. Called me and I hadn't heard the news yet, and she shared it with me, and it was just like I paused for this moment, just looking out the window of this RV in the mountains, by the way, which is kind of ironic, I guess, in a way. Just an incredible, all those memories came kind of flooding back. The eulogy, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher before, that she delivered at that funeral, where she finished with, well done, good and faithful servant, well done. And that's one of the greatest eulogies I think I've ever seen. You think about the images of his, his riding boots backward on the horse as they're pulling the hearse through Washington, D.C. Incredibly moving. And then Nancy Reagan at the gravesite, which, by the way, I visited 3 days ago. And we've been here in Santa Barbara. They got more rain here in the last 3 days than any other November in history. So much for the enjoying the California sun. The blessing of that was we took a day to go to the Reagan library and to his gravesite, which was really, really moving. But the images of her just not being able to leave that casket at the end of the memorial services just absolutely burned into my brain. So an incredible human being. I'll end with a little bit of humor. I was I go on a ski trip every February with a group of friends. We've been doing this for, I don't know, probably 15 years, give or take. And people bring up interesting conversations and so or questions, and so we're sitting around the table and someone's like, which members of your family are on your home screen for your on your screen for your iPhone, right? And so everybody picks up their family picture. One's got a picture with his wife, one is his wife and his kids, one of it's him and his kids, and it gets to be my turn, and I hold my phone up and it's Ronald Reagan. Which so I was a little bit embarrassed, and unfortunately my family saw the humor in that, but that's what that man has meant to me, so much so that he's my screensaver on my iPhone, and to spend the time that we did today at the ranch was just incredibly special. Can't thank you enough. Have to thank, of course, my friends Kurt Bauer and Wade Goodsell at Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, where I'm proud to serve on the board, for putting this all together, and many other members of their team that made this happen, but especially to you for your incredible hospitality, everything we've learned, and not just today, but everything you've done for the state of Wisconsin, for the United States of America. It's been a total honor, Governor, to have you on again. I really appreciate you joining us.
Well, my absolute pleasure to have you here, and a pleasure to be back with you.
It's been awesome to have this conversation with former Wisconsin Governor, now President of Young America's Foundation, Scott Walker. We had all kinds of great stuff that we talked about that we will link up in the show notes for you. Talked about some videos of Nancy Reagan, talked about some great speeches. Those will all be there, so please check those out. We will put those let's put them at techedpodcast.com/YAF. That's techedpodcast.com/YAF. When you're all done there, come check us out on social media. You will find us on YouTube. You'll find us on TikTok. You will find us on Instagram, on Facebook, wherever you go for your social media, you will find the Tech Ed Podcast. When you're there, say hello. We would love to hear from you, and can't wait to see you again next week on the Tech Ed Podcast. Thanks for being with us.